right, good morning, everybody, and happy to see you all here today. I'd like to welcome you to today's strategic farming program, Let's Talk Crops. And today we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of on-farm research. And again, just a reminder, this program is brought to you by U of M Extension and also the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and the Corn Growers Research and Promotion Council. I'm Liz Stahl, I'm Extension Educator in Crops out of the Worthington Regional Office, and happy today to have us, join with us today is Dr. Bob Neilsen. He's the Extension Corn Specialist out of Purdue University, also known as the Corn Guy and all that too. So again, really excited to have him with us today. That's one of the silver linings, I guess you could say, out of this whole pandemic thing, is that doing stuff online, Bob doesn't have to go jump in the car from Indiana to come and join us. He can just hop on the computer, and I'm glad to have him join us today. And also Dr. Seth Naeve, our Extension Soybean Specialist, will be joining in on the discussion today too. So glad to have him with us as well. And again, just a reminder, if you haven't been on one of these programs before, we try to have about 10 minutes of presentation or so, and then we just open it up for discussion, taking questions from you out of the Q&A. Please do enter any questions you might have in the Q&A. The chat's kind of more for technical issues, but you can still use that if that's what works best too. But again, do encourage you to use that Q&A. And also note that, on one moment too, if you're not familiar with Zoom, if you hover your mouse near the bottom of your screen, that toolbar should pop up where you'll find like the Q&A box and the chat box and so forth. And note at the end here, we'll have a very short evaluation. I do encourage you to please do fill that out. Again, it's only 3 questions, but again, we do appreciate that feedback. And we will have a recording of this that will be posted on within about a week on our website. So with that, I will turn it over to Bob.
All right. Thank you, Liz. Yeah, we were joking earlier that it's just easy now to sort of jump in the virtual car and head to Minnesota for a half hour, an hour kind of discussion with you. So I'm glad to do it. I'd like to say it's good to be back in Minnesota, because I sort of wish I was back in Minnesota. That's where I did my graduate work years ago. And I've been at Purdue ever since, and I'm approaching 40 years and I'm nearing the end of my career here. But this past year, and again, Liz and I were talking earlier, it's sort of amazing what we've learned, all of us have learned in the past 11 months. And, a lot of it's been depressing, but frankly, there's been some unintended positive things. And I think for some of us old graybeards, this opportunity to learn about Zoom and virtual and everything associated with it has been sort of fun. But let me start, let me do this first, but then I'm also going to share this to make sure. So just a few comments I want to make about field scale research that maybe will jumpstart the discussion and maybe make you think of some questions that we can deal with later. I am the Extension Corn Specialist here at Indiana. It's the similar position that Jeff Coulter has at Minnesota. And again, I've been here since the early 80s and have focused on corn research and extension. And let me get my mouse where it should be. There we go. So when I'm talking about field scale research, I'm talking about trials that average, say, from 30 to 80 acres or more in size. This is the size of the entire trial. Looking at individual plots that range typically from 30 feet wide to 60 feet or more. And they run the length of the field, as you can sort of tell by the image in the background. This is roughly, I think it's a 45-acre field trial. And those plots, individual plots, range from about 1,700 to over 2,000 feet long. And so a pretty big scale. And because of this, we use commercial farming equipment to do this kind of research. And almost by necessity, we're using and taking advantage of precision ag technology. And then, of course, we're using mapping software and GIS software to design the plots themselves, to work with the spatial data that we generate from the trials, and then analyze the data at the end of the day. And the beauty of this precision ag technology, and if you've been around as long as I have, maybe it sinks in a little more. And if you grew up with the technology, maybe it's not as impressive. But the beauty of precision ag technology is that, first of all, it minimizes the logistical headaches for the farmer cooperator in doing these kinds of field scale trials. When I started in the early 80s, the idea of asking a farmer to jump through the hoops that would be necessary to do a well-designed on-farm trial were just simply too unmanageable for the grower, just too many headaches. And this precision ag technology today allows us to maybe not just minimize these headaches, but in many cases, we can almost zero them out. And because we can do stuff with precision ag technology, that also allows us as researchers to conduct these large field scale trials that are statistically sound. And that's the key thing. In the early days, I could have compromised on things to minimize the headaches for the grower, but that probably would have also compromised the statistical soundness of the trials that we did. And so the precision ag technology allows us to balance out both of these issues and allows us to do stuff today that I could only dream about back in the early 80s. Yield monitors were pretty much the first of the precision ag technology that began to enable us to do this kind of field scale research. And the primary benefit of the yield monitor was to simply reduce the harvest logistics for the grower. In the old days, we would weigh every single plot in an on-farm trial with a weigh wagon, and usually it was a seed company weigh wagon with limited capacity. So almost by default, that would limit how big the individual plots could be. Whereas today, once we've calibrated the monitor, it's nearly nonstop harvesting. And in fact, in most cases, the farmer is simply harvesting a field as they normally would. And we grab the data at the end of the day from the yield monitor. And because of all this, it does allow us to use fields that are much bigger than we could have in the past, and individual plots that are much larger. And then that, along with the fact that we can manage the geospatial yield data, that now also gives us the opportunity to evaluate how crops respond to whatever treatments we're interested in, but how they respond to treatments in different areas of the field. In other words, it allows us to do more site-specific analysis much easier than we could have, say, 20, 30 years ago. And let me assure you, before you ask the question, that grain yields can be estimated accurately using yield monitors. And of course, it's all about calibration. It's our experience that with proper calibration, we can limit the rate of that error of estimating grain weight to 1% or less. If you look at many of the manufacturer operators manuals for yield monitors, somewhere in there's usually a sentence that says, well, if you're above 5%, start over or something like that. Well, 5% that's not acceptable. That's absolutely not acceptable. And it is easy to calibrate these monitors and keep it well below 1%. In fact, it's not unusual to actually get it calibrated down to 0. All right. So just let me assure you, with proper calibration techniques, and we can maybe go into more detail on what those techniques are in the question and answer, but with proper calibration techniques, we can limit the error rates of estimating grain weight and end up, frankly, with statistical data that is better quality than I can typically generate from small plots. Another of the precision ag technologies that help facilitate or implement treatments is the use of variable rate controllers that can use prescriptions that are created ahead of time to do things like apply different rates of nitrogen in a trial, or maybe different seeding rates in a trial. This screenshot is of one of our trials. It's a nitrogen rate trial. It's a side dress trial. And if you look closely and count, you'll find 6 different colors in these individual plots. They represent the 6 different nitrogen rates. And of course, they're replicated throughout the field. In this case, they're replicated 5 times, and they're nicely randomized through the field. And in the old days, without the use of variable rate controllers, asking a grower to implement these kinds of rates across a field was just absolutely asinine. I mean, you just wouldn't ask a person to do it. But now we can create these prescriptions ahead of time, and we make sure it fits the field. We give them to the grower uploads them to the variable rate controller, hops into the tractor and applicator, and simply side dresses the field as they normally would. And so it allows us to simplify the implementation of trials that use something like rates of an input. Now, some growers still don't have variable rate controllers, or sometimes the treatments we're interested in are simply not compatible with creating prescriptions. So for example, let's say we're looking at two different kinds of foliar fungicides and we want to compare them with a zero treatment. Well, that's really not compatible with variable rate. But we can still use technology, especially auto navigation or auto guidance technology, to allow us to implement all of the randomized replicates of these treatments and maybe do one treatment, all the reps of it first, and then switch out and do the other one. Let me show you an example of what they may look like. So this is an example of 5 reps of a single treatment and the corresponding swath identification numbers that are used for auto guidance of the application equipment. So in this example, treatment number 1, we plan it all out ahead of time, of course. So treatment number 1 may end up in swath number 4, swath number 10, 21, 26, and 33, as indicated on this slide. And then and let's say it's foliar fungicide applications. And so we load up the applicator with that foliar fungicide. And with the auto guidance technology, we simply navigate to swath number 4. We apply the treatment. At the end of that treatment, we navigate to swath number 10, apply that treatment, et cetera, through the whole field. Now, admittedly, the logistics of this is more cumbersome than using, say, something like a variable rate controller, but yet it is still possible to do. And frankly, when it comes down to it, the logistics are pretty manageable. And we have growers that are fully willing to do this kind of treatment implementation using the technology. And then, of course, most of the precision ag technology we use today logs what happens. And so we get this so-called as-applied data at the end of the day. And that has been a real godsend to simply help us document whether we put out what we wanted to put out. And we sort of laugh at ourselves now, thinking back to the old days where we weren't able to verify what was put out in a field. And now with these logged application data, we can verify the accuracy of what the planter did, what the fertilizer applicator did, what the sprayers did. And it allows us to verify that the treatments we wanted to apply were in fact applied, or in some cases we discover there were problems with the application equipment. And that's also good data to have, because then that allows us to maybe delete one or more plots from the analysis at the end of the day. And so we use as applied data quite a bit to mostly just to document the treatment inputs. Now, I mentioned the fact that these field scale trials also allow us to begin to evaluate spatial crop responses to treatments. And so here's an example of one of our larger trials that we've done. This is a plant population trial. It's a 150-acre plant population trial. Each of those colored rectangular plots are 16 rows by, on average, about 4,600 feet long. And if you count the number of colors, you'll find there are 6 different seeding rates, and they're replicated 6 times. So this is a 150-acre plant population trial. And the next slide shows the soil map layer of that field on top of the plot map. And in this particular field, there were 7 different soil types. Now, they were all silt loams, but on paper, they were 7 different soil types. And you can tell by the way they lay in the field that they were actually pretty conducive to doing this trial, because they pretty much lay perpendicular to the direction of the plots. And so, we have 7 different soil types in this 150-acre trial. And then at the end of the day, once we harvest the yield data with our GIS software, we first of all merge or intersect that yield data with the plot layer, so that every yield data point now has the plot number, the rep number, and the population. And then we intersect it one more time with the soil map. And so now every yield data point has not only all the plot information attached to it, but it also has the soil map data attached to every data point. And so what I'm showing you on this slide is actually, or technically, it's yield data, but I am displaying the soil map attributes of the yield data. And so once we get to this point, then I can clip the yield data for every one of these 7 soil types. And basically, I end up with 7 different trials. And so I look at the yield response to population for each of these 7 soil types, because every soil type in the field had at least 2 reps worth of plant populations going through the soil type. And so at the end of the day, I'm able to determine, does one soil type have a different optimum population than another? And in the case of this field, it allows us then to generate this kind of a summary where what we're looking at here is yield response to population for every one of the 7 soil types in that field. Now, don't need to go in a whole lot of detail on this, but in this case, well, let me see if I can get my annotation up and running. Let me see, I'll get that. And let me see if I can do this right. Yeah, okay. So this AOPP is the agronomic optimum population. That's the population where we achieved maximum yield. The EOPP is the economic optimum population based on, in this case, $3.50 corn and $240 seed corn. Well, if you look at the agronomic optimums, you see actually quite a range of optimum populations. The greatest population is on the Seidel silt loam of nearly 40,000 plants per acre. And the lowest agronomic population is up in the cyclone silt loam of about 26,000, okay? Let me clear this out so it gets a little, whereas on the economic optimum populations, it ranges from, again, roughly 26,000 to roughly 30,000, okay? And so in this one field, in this one example, the economic optimum populations range from 26 to nearly 31,000 based on the economic parameters that we're using in that particular field. The one thing I should point out on this is, for example, it would be, let's see, I guess it'd be the Seidel, this line right there. Looks to be a nice linear yield, well, it is a linear yield response to population, and that is this one right there. Agronomically, it topped out at 40,000 plants per acre. Economically, the economic optimum yield was close to 26,000. And you might ask, how can that be when it's a linear yield response? Well, if you are the astute viewer of graphs, you'll notice that I abused one of my prime design restrictions. I started the y-axis at 150 bushel. And what that does is, unfortunately, it magnifies the differences between treatments in a trial, and you really shouldn't do this. But I wanted to show you that, in fact, there were differences among these soils, but on this Seidel that topped out at 40,000 agronomically, it begins at about 220 bushel and it ends at about 228 bushel. And so it only gained about 8 bushel, and you spent what, 15,000 seeds per acre to do it. It just isn't economical, right? Anyway, I shouldn't get into that much of a detail, but let's get back to the on-farm trials. So the benefit to farmers, at least in my opinion, the benefits to farmers from collaborating in this kind of field scale research are several. One is the growers that work with us get first look at the research results. So it's sort of selfish benefit to them. Secondly, the research that we're conducting, hopefully, the intent is to help improve yield and profit. So if we conduct the research and get enough site years of data to feel good about the reliability of what we learn, they will improve yield and profit by virtue of participating with us. There are some secondary benefits that farmers tell us. These are not our opinions, but farmers often tell us that they value the time that they're simply able to spend with us as researchers and extension specialists. And so, we're often there during planting time and during harvest. And if in the case of, say, something like a side dress trial, we're usually there when we're side dressing, and we're riding shotgun in the cabs with these growers and not only talking about the trials, but talking about a lot of agronomic issues. And our growers tell us they really value that time, essentially just shooting the breeze with us about agronomics in general. And then as they spend time with us, hopefully over more than 1 year of conducting trials, they simply get exposed to good research practices so that when we're done doing trials with them, they can continue on with their own on-farm trials, and they have a little more experience and knowledge on how to conduct trials correctly. So these are some of the benefits to growers from collaborating with us. But as researchers, we also enjoy benefits from this kind of on-farm collaboration. First of all, by being able to supplement the trials we do on the Purdue research farms with on-farm trials, it allows us to build a large database more quickly. And because of that, it allows us to develop guidelines and recommendations for our clientele more quickly, and that's a big benefit to us. And then because we expand our testing areas around the state, we can evaluate these treatments over a much wider range of growing conditions, especially soils and weather patterns and pest problems. And because we can evaluate treatments over a wider range of growing conditions, we're better able to identify practices that in themselves are more reliable and more consistent. And so that helps us develop more reliable and credible guidelines for our clientele. And, when we always talk about, who brings what to the table on these kinds of trials. And I tried to show that on this slide where, and I realize now let me get rid of this mark I had on there. And I've tried to illustrate on the slide what both sides bring to the table. And of course, the farmer's bringing a lot to the table when we're doing on-farm research. They're bringing the land, their equipment, their precision ag technologies, and some maybe social things they're bringing. Hopefully they're interested in the trial. If not, we really don't want them. They need a lot of patience because us researchers tend to be, shall we say, difficult to work with. And they need to have the ability to pay a lot of attention to detail because they are very much a researcher in this project too. And so they need to pay a lot of attention to detail, just like we do. As researchers, we bring maybe more of the soft skills. We bring our experience with research. We bring our experience with field scouting. We bring our experience with collecting data and analyzing data. And these are the things we bring to the table to help make a successful on-farm trial. And if that all comes together, it makes for a beautiful experience. Let me just remind you that the simple goal for any field research project, ideally, is to identify crop management practices that are profitable most of the time. And the key phrase in that statement is most of the time. The biggest challenge we face in field research is sampling enough weather patterns or enough growing conditions to identify practices that are pretty reliable. And again, that's part of the beauty of combining on-farm trials with university research farms. And, it's not necessarily simple to identify these reliable practices because what works well in one field may not work in another simply because of different conditions. And all of us understand this. And for years, this is why farmers would sort of roll their eyes at us when we show them data from small plots because they'd say, that's not the real world. It doesn't work that way out here in the real world. Well, even when we are working in the real world, what works in one field may not work for another. So it's a challenge to sample enough growing conditions. And even for the same field, because the weather patterns differ one year to another, pest problems differ, yield levels differ one year to another. This is what you're looking at is one field and 4 years worth of yield maps, all and with all the same yield legends. So the dark green is yields above 200 bushels, the red is below 50. I mean, just look at the difference in yield in one field over 4 different years. So even for the same field, a practice that works well one year may not work well in another because of growing conditions. So again, the prime challenge of not just conducting field research, but developing guidelines from that research is to sample as many growing conditions as we can. And so, I reiterate that on this slide. The key to successful field research is to evaluate that crop response to treatments over as many growing conditions as we can. And it's some combination of multiple locations and multiple years. So consequently, and this, I'll admit, this is sort of a bug that I've got about on-farm research. The value of on-farm research is not what we learn from a single trial. In fact, I often tell growers when we're working with them that I could care less what happens on their field. What I care about is what we learn when we combine their field with a lot of others, because now we're sampling growing conditions, all right? We're trying to find practices that work reliably over a wide range of conditions, okay? So that's why I get a little bent out of shape when I see examples of research that's done on 1 or 2 farms and that's it. Or maybe done on 1 farm, 2 years, and that's it. That is not the value of on-farm research. It's the pulling it together, aggregating it together is where we really learn what's going on with some of these management practices. In our own case here in Indiana, with the work that Jim Cambrato and I have done over the years, we've done about 250 nitrogen management trials around the state. And on this map, the circles, the red circles represent all of the Purdue research farms around the state. The yellow counties are the counties where we've had on-farm trials over the years. So we've had about 250 nitrogen management trials, and the vast majority of them have been on-farm. We've had about 100 plant population trials, and again, I think roughly half of them have been on-farm. In recent years, we're focusing more on starter fertilizer, biologicals, and sulfur fertilizer. We don't have as many trials of those yet. But the on-farm research collaborations, I just emphasize this one more time, that collaborating on-farm not only adds site years to our database, but it allows us to broaden where we're able to get data from around the state. If we only operated at the Purdue farms, there's a huge part of the state that we just simply would never sample and evaluate crop responses to. So it's been a huge benefit to us as we develop guidelines for some of these practices. And I'll just finish with this, that field scale research, first of all, is logistically doable, and the technology is what allows us to do it. Because it's logistically doable, that allows us to design trials that are statistically sound. And because of all that, it helps us develop reliable guidelines for farmers. And finally, doing this is just a heck of a lot of fun. I can't think of anything I've done in research over the years that's been as enjoyable as the field scale research that we're able to do with growers. We developed some really good friendships. Selfishly, I think it enhances Purdue's name recognition around the state and extensions recognition around the state. And it's just a lot of fun to be with. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen, Liz, and get me back to a full screen.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Yeah, lots of great information, and things really have changed, that's for sure, in on-farm research. And again, Seth, too, if you want to pipe in on anything here too. But Bob, there's a lot of questions that have popped up here in the Q&A, so I'll try to kind of sort through those. But one of them says, "Thank you for the corny newsletter." So I had to put that in there. So yes,
Thanks.
that's a nice resource that you've been doing over the years.
Hey, Liz, can I follow up real quick with
Yep.
Bob? I've got a question for him. So you really came around nicely at the end to this point about localized data, on-farm data generated by the farmers themselves for their own use versus the big collective database. And so I want to circle back to that a little bit, because I think that's really an important point. And I guess I'll take the farmer standpoint or the devil's advocate, or however you'd like to look at this. So how do you feel about this on-farm research now as a way to democratize research and localized research? And I know you stated it very clearly about the value of single point data. But where is there a middle point? Is there something that farmers need to do? Is there a validation type of program that they need to do along or following your work? Or is there ways that they should we be looking to pool data like Iowa soybean on-farm network types of programs and Nebraska programs? Mm-hmm. Where do you think is the next, what beyond what you're doing, what's that next kind of localized, true farmer facilitated, localized research? Where's the line?
Yeah. It's a good question, Seth. I'm not sure I've got a good answer. Because we've struggled with that a little bit here, Jim Cambrato and I, that, we have focused on a very few number of topics, and you saw them on that one of those last slides. And so I guess our objective, our strategy has been to limit the number of topics or questions that we're researching, but try to get as many site years as we can. We started with nitrogen and plant population because, at least, back in the, say, 2005, 6, 7, those were clearly the lion's share of the variable cost production for corn. And so it was just crucial to make sure that we're dealing with economic rates for those two particular inputs. So we chose to start on those two, and we geared up at our Purdue farms. Fortunately, we have a lot of large fields at our Purdue farms, and Jim and I are often accused of being the reigning land barons at all of the Purdue farms because we have most of the big fields. But we supplemented them with all of our own farm trials, but they were very focused. It was nitrogen rates and plant populations, and it was our protocol. And our goal was to generate some guidelines that we could believe in, and we believe we've done it. And they were pretty easy trials to do on farm because we could use variable rate controllers, and so it was extremely easy logistically for growers to do. And so that's why we had a lot of buy-in. What we have avoided, I guess that's the word, avoided doing, is jumping on board with, say, a dozen different topics with maybe a handful of growers for each topic. And I'm trying to be cautious with how I say this because I don't want to insult people. And I certainly would not deny anyone their right to conduct their own on-farm research. In fact, I encourage it. I just want people to know that when you're sort of doing it as a lone wolf with only your farm or maybe a couple of neighbors' farms, but only generating 2, 3, 5 site years, locations a year, you're not learning very rapidly. And again, the key thing, it's sort of the same as choosing hybrids, that it's not just finding what works in one year, it's finding what works most years. And that requires a lot of weather pattern or a lot of growing conditions. And that almost by necessity means you're looking at 50, 100, 150 site years if you want to do it right. And again, that's I mean, I'll admit I sort of struggle with that, as I know that there's a lot of other questions we could be looking at. But in our case, since Jim and I have also been essentially the coordinators, we can only handle so many each year. And we've chosen to operate that way. I mean, we could have expanded like Nebraska has, or Ohio State has, or Iowa has. We have just simply chosen not to, I guess, partly because we don't quite agree with the strategy, because it's more of a shotgun and less of a focused. And I'm not sure if that's a good response to you, Seth, but because I do sort of struggle explaining myself sometimes and justifying why we've chosen to do the way that we've done it. But for these, and I guess we sort of justify it because we've chosen to look at inputs that we think are the biggest dollar inputs. Whereas, we can go off on all sorts of directions on inputs that are maybe, $5 an acre inputs. Well, okay. I mean, yeah, it's $5 an acre is $5 an acre, but it's not quite the same as $100 seed cost, And so that's right or wrong. That's been the direction that we've gone with this. Now, I'm always willing to work with growers to design trials and even analyze their data. And I certainly never turn anybody down on that. But again, I just think people need to understand that it's this necessity of identifying crop response over a wide range of conditions so that is it going to work 8 years out of 10, or is it going to work 1 year out of 10?
Okay, so I heard you say you need 200 site years of data. So, okay, thank you for that. So the next extension from that though is what have you learned about extrapolating that data within fields that have cross soil types? Has that allowed you to expand your inference space on these studies? So you've got light and coarse textured, light and sandy soils, you've got heavy soils within a site. Are you able now to better push your inference space out further because you have that level of detail within each of those 200 sites?
Yes and no. At a somewhat higher altitude, for example, our nitrogen trials in Indiana, we've got sort of a natural gradient of soil drainage capability from particularly west to east, and somewhat better drained soils in the west, more poorly drained soils in the east and northeast. Because we've had, and actually, let me just supplement what your 200 data point thing that you said. I would say, yes, you need 200, 250 data points, only because in each region of the state, we think we need roughly 40 or 50. Well, that means on a statewide basis, we've got a trial that's 200 to 250 total, number of site years. But we feel comfortable in a region of the state if we can get somewhere between 30 and 50 to come up with guidelines for a region of the state, especially for nitrogen, because we've got these differences around the state. And so what we've been able to learn is that there's no question in Western Indiana, the typical economic end rate is going to be somewhere in the ballpark of 150 to 170 pounds of N. Whereas in the eastern and northeastern parts of the state, because of the generally more poorly drained soils, higher risk of denitrification loss, we need more nitrogen fertilizer, and the economic end rates in those areas of the state is closer to, instead of say 150 to 170, it's closer to 220 or 230, which was not received very well by growers, because in those areas of the state with poorly drained soils, their yields tend to be lower anyway. And here we were telling them, oh, by the way, in addition to getting lower yields, you need to put on more nitrogen. And that did not go well, but that's what the data told us. Now, within fields, where we can, we have tried to look at these spatial responses within fields. And interestingly, for both nitrogen and population, where we've had more trials, interestingly, we have seen very few examples of within field differences for optimum rates of nitrogen or population. And that's been a surprise. Now, of course, in population, you can imagine that the exceptions are if you've got areas of the fields that are, say, exceptionally coarse textured or sandy and drought prone versus the better water holding areas of the field. But nevertheless, we've been surprised that we've seen few instances of any benefits. I mean, this is the take home, is that there's very few benefits to variable rating for nitrogen and population in most of our fields. And that, again, has been a surprise. But like the example I showed in my slide set of that 150 acre trial, where basically we're getting 7 trials for the price of 1 because we have 7 soil types in that field. Those huge fields allow us to do the spatial analyses to determine it. And just as an aside, if you look closely at that trial, we were not using variable rate seeding rates. We were using straight seeding rates going through the entire field, but they crossed the 7 different soils. And so within each soil type, we did a simple yield response to population analysis. And frankly, I think that's the only way to ask the variable rate question, is to do it field scale with straight rates going through the field and then clipping the data later by whatever feature that you're looking at.
All right, and I'll just a housekeeping thing. We have gone past our 9 o'clock time, so I know if people needed to leave at 9, you're more than welcome to do that too. But if you want to hang on, we've got a bunch of questions here I'd like to try to get addressing here too. So if you want to hang on, that would be wonderful. And we'll start looking at some of these. Just kind of, again, because we're talking about nuts and bolts of on-farm research. One question is, how far should they stay away from like tree lines when doing an on-farm trial, if you want to address that?
As far as you can, Jerome. I mean, maybe the simplest way to address that is, go out there in the morning and look at the shade when the sun's coming up. I mean, how far out does it? I mean, I'm trying to think in my head quick of fields. All right, so if it's the ends of the plots going up to the tree line, I don't care because I'll clip off the ends of the plots. If I've got plots running along the tree lines, that's a different story. And then let's say if we're talking trees that are, I don't know, let's say 100-foot tall or something like that, I'll probably essentially the height of the trees horizontal is about how far I'll try to keep plots away from it. That's not very scientific. That's just sort of what we do. Fortunately, we've never had that many fields that were small enough that where we felt we had to really crowd up against the trees. So we were able to keep more than enough in most of our fields. And again, if it's the ends of the fields, the ends of the plots that are butting up in the tree lines, I don't care because I'm usually clipping off at least, all the end rows and an additional 75 feet into the plot. I usually clip off anyway when I'm looking at the data.
Okay, and here's some questions about like with yield monitors. One question here is here we can experience test weights varying from 56 to 62 pounds. It's made it difficult to keep yield monitors within that 1% tolerance, so they use a weigh wagon to back up their trials. What yield monitors are you using to get that tolerance within 1%?
And I'm assuming James or Jim is answering that or asking that in terms of hybrid trials, I'm going to guess. And it is true that yield monitors for hybrid trials is really risky. And I frankly, unless you're going to calibrate to every hybrid, which you can, but unless you're going to do that, you do have to be very careful with yield monitors for hybrid trials, partly for test weight differences, partly for other characteristics of the kernels that maybe they pack differently or they go up the clean grain elevator differently and hit the yield impact sensor differently. You betcha. We did some trials, oh boy, it's probably been back 10 years ago, looking at differences among hybrids, and you bet there can be a whale of an impact on calibration accuracy with a hybrid trial. Personally, I'm not involved with hybrid trials, so I guess I tend to forget about that issue. So the most we would have is say a nitrogen trial or a population trial where we happen to have two hybrids in the trial. Then we will calibrate for each hybrid, set up a separate calibration for each hybrid in that trial to try and avoid that kind of problem.
Well, that's helpful. And this kind of relates to this too. Question from Tom is, I've been told that if you expect your treatments to result in grain moisture differences, yield monitors become less accurate and weigh wagons may be necessary. So any thoughts on this? So this kind of relates to that too.
Yeah, and maybe the answer is yes. And maybe the way to address that is, for example, in our nitrogen trials, especially the ones we do on the Purdue farms, where we're able to persuade the farm managers to let us put in a starter only treatment. So, we're looking at yields that are 50% yields or more, but also grain moisture changes quite a bit when you've got a near zero nitrogen treatment versus a full. So again, if we expect or if we know we're going to see, and I'm sitting here trying to think now of what range of moistures do I get concerned about. I would say that if you expect a range of moisture differences greater than, and I'm partly just pulling this out of thin air, but I'll say more than say 3 points difference in moisture, I would see if I could set up a separate calibration for those different treatments. I mean, a good point and perfectly valid, because there's no question as grain moisture changes, calibration accuracy changes during the course of a harvest season. That's absolutely true. But within a trial, again, whenever we expect huge treatment effects of yield or huge treatment effects of moisture, we try to set up different calibrations for each of those situations. It obviously adds a little more headache to the day, but it is doable.
Okay, and here's somebody asked too, just kind of related to, again, thinking about calibration. Doug here has an Ag Leader PF3000 combine monitor. Seems real hard to get this monitor accurate enough for test plots, no matter how many calibrations I do. Is it just too old of a monitor to be accurate?
Yeah, I'm always good at telling people to spend money. Buy a new yield monitor, damn it. Don't be such a... We worked with PF 3000s for years, long time ago, but years. And we could, and it is true, we could never calibrate them as accurately as we can with today's newer models. I think it's not so much the impact sensor, because the impact sensor hasn't changed that much over the years. I think simply the algorithms in the black box have gotten much, much better. And of course, the old PF 3000s, I'm sure you can't even update those anymore. So, but having said that, we could still, it's been so long since I've thought about those calibrations, we could still get those, I'll say, within 2% error. I'm pretty sure. And again, the key in calibration of yield impact sensor monitors, the key is to try to put together calibration loads that represent the range of yields you expect to see in the field. And of course, that means a range of grain flow. Well, the best way there's two ways to do it. The easiest way is to do calibrations at different speeds in the field, and that will generate different grain flow per second. And if you think about it, if you normally harvest it at 4 mile an hour, but you expect yields that are half of something in the field, well, then a 2 mile an hour calibration load will generate an adequate calibration load for that half yield. Okay. The other way to do it is with different number of rows in the header to generate different grain flow, but speed's about as easy to do as anything. So again, we've been very religious about calibrating and trying to come up with these different grain flow rates to represent what we expect to see in the field. And when we do that, almost invariably with new monitors, we can get it down to 0.5%. With the old PF 3000s, again, memory serves me that we could still get it to 2% or less, even on the PF 3000. So I'm not sure what you're seeing when you calibrate with yours, but it can be done, just not as gnat's whisker as we can do it today, but it could still be done.
Hey, Liz, can I, let me nest these last two questions for Bob. I think these are good, larger philosophical questions. We can get away a little bit from the technology for a second. So I like these last two questions. So one is, how do I change my practices for the current year's conditions? And so I assume that means it's going to be a droughty year, it's going to be a cold year, whatever. And then the other person says, averages do not fit my farm. Okay, so please, yeah. I think those two questions have a common thread with them. So yeah. Maybe you can help us with those.
Well, the first question is easy because you and I can't predict what this year's conditions are going to be anyway. All right, so there's no sense in even trying to play that game because we can't predict what this summer is going to be, which is why, and I'm an old curmudgeon, this is why you look for the data, you generate the data that tells you what works most of the time. And it sort of answers the last question that, yes, I agree, averages may not fit your farm, but it's the only game in town, right? You got to go for the averages, and that's not even the right term. You got to go with the practices that from the data that's been generated are the most reliable. Yes, even on our nitrogen, we've got 250 nitrogen trials around the state. We feel pretty good with those recommendations. We still call them ballpark recommendations because we know that on any given field, it's going to be wrong almost every year. It's going to be a little off to one side, a little off to the other. Once in a while, it'll be dead on. But we firmly believe that if you stick to these ballparks, you will never go wrong dramatically, okay? And that's what it's about, is with this ever-increasing variable climate or weather patterns, and our inability to predict them, we can continue to harangue on the weather forecasters until they finally figure out how to do this. So we can always butcher those people and say, if you would only tell us what it was going to be, we could know what to do. Well, we don't know what it's going to be. And so we look, and so let me go back to hybrids, all right? And yes, we look for hybrids with good genetic yield potential. But if that's the only thing we're due, it's not going to be as effective compared to looking for hybrids with good yield potential that also have a wide range of tolerance to growing conditions. All right, we talk about drought tolerant hybrids. Well, okay, fine, but some of the drought tolerant hybrids are simply damn good hybrids, even in a good year. All right, that's what I want to find. I want to find a hybrid that's pretty good most of the time, even in a drought year, but even in a good year. because I don't know what next year is going to be. So again, it does come, and again, averages is not the right term to use. It's more about reliability. And so again, back to our nitrogen work, we tell people to start with the ballpark. And then we say, okay, on the fly, let's say you normally side dress. So by the time you get to side dress, let's say it's been a fairly dry or slightly drier spring so far. And so you can assume you've probably not lost much nitrogen. And so maybe you can back off on the ballpark guidelines. Or in contrast, my God, it's been a terribly wet spring. And oh man, I'll bet all the starters gone. I'll bet we lost other nitrogen. So this is the year I'm going to take the ballpark and add 20 or 30, 40 more pounds to it. Right? We can play those games on the fly. And frankly, I think be fairly effective. But we're starting with a ballpark recommendation that's pretty darn good to begin with. And that's based on a lot, and I shouldn't just say a lot of trials, but a lot of growing conditions in order to determine, is it reliable most of the time? And that's, again, the biggest challenge we face as researchers is identifying reliability.
And I would just add,
go ahead.
I just add one point on top of that relative to on-farm testing. Again, back to this idea that farmers testing on their own farms. As you mentioned, a performance of one of these agronomic practices isn't predictable one year to the next from a single farm. So a farmer is much better off utilizing data from surrounding farms, multiple surrounding farms, than they are from their own hybrids or populations, nitrogen, whatever. That's half of it. Then the other half of it is this precision piece that you brought up, that farmers would really have to trust their own testing in order to ensure that what their answers that they see or their feeling of their responses that they're getting on their farm are actually real. And not perceived differences or impacts of those things. So that's the kind of way that I break up those two pieces.
Right. Too. And earlier you mentioned democratizing research, and in the case of what Jim Camerato and I do, again, we can't handle that many trials alone. But if you look at the Iowa model or the Nebraska model, you got a lot more organization. In theory, you could. And that is a form of democratization of research of what they're doing in some of these other states. I just wish they would encourage many, many, many more cooperators looking at the same question, because there's questions like, how many years do you normally use for the same field? Well, to a certain degree, I'd say I don't care. That's not important to me. What I care about is how many fields period can I get a year. All right. So because again, I hate to sound crass, but I really don't care what happens on your field. What I care about is your field and your neighbor's fields, and you're beyond your neighbor's fields. What's that whole area of the state telling me? Because honestly, your field's not that special compared to your neighbor's fields. You're all pretty much in the same weather pattern. You pretty much all have similar soils, and you might be a better farmer than your neighbor. But in the big scheme of things, it's the growing conditions. And that's what we're trying to get at. And you only do that with buku number of trials gathered as quickly as you can, because we can't afford to wait to come up with good guidelines. So
I've got a question here, the one relating to test plot size too. They're talking about, 180 inches wide by at least 2,000 feet. I mean, do you want to comment anything about how big of a plot size? And that relates to a question I was thinking about too, when you're looking at putting these strips across the field, you've got, unequal sizes, and that's something when we always talk about small plot research, we wanted to have equal size plots.
In equal length?
Well, yeah, equal length, I should say, but you're going to have like differences in lengths. I mean, but so what kind of is a minimum length size that you would look at, and look at width too? I would assume you want to get at least the combine width.
So the first thing I'll admit is that I'm a very dirty statistician. And my colleague Jim Camerato often razzes me about how loosey-goosey I am with statistics. So that's the first admission. Secondly, we don't care if they're variable length. We just don't care. I mean, because we're not using weigh wagons, right, to harvest them. We don't need to worry about length in that regard. And we've got trials that may run, depending on the way the field is shaped, from maybe 1,000 foot long to 2,000 feet in the same field. I really don't care. It just has no bearing. And so the only thing I say is I want field length, because we've got enough experience chopping field length into shorter segments that our statistical variation just ramps up something fierce, which is it's weird to think about that. We actually get better quality data from field length going through all of the different spatial variability in that field. We get better data than if we chop it up into 200-foot plots and have a bunch of those going through the field. I can't explain it, but that's just the way it is. So we prefer field length no matter what it is. We don't like anything shorter than about 300 feet, simply because we chop off 50 to 75 feet on each end, and that just doesn't leave us much if we're shorter than about 300 feet. But I'll take as long as I can get, whatever it is. Width for corn generally is twice the width of the combine header, generally. Now, it also needs to match up with everything else that's going on. So, if we've got a trial this year where I think the planter's 40 foot, the combine head is 20 foot, but the nitrogen applicator is 80. Well, that forces us into 80-foot plots just because of the applicator. Okay, so it's compatible with everything that you need for the trial in terms of width, but generally it tends to be twice the width of the header, because then we harvest the middle header width out of that plot to avoid any possible residual effects from neighboring plots. So we harvest the middle, let's say in a 16-row plot, we'll harvest the middle 8. The next 8 are bulk data. The next 8 is plot, et cetera, et cetera. So the farmer, other than scooching over to begin harvesting in the middle of a planter pass, from that point, the farmer just harvests, and I clip out the data from the bulk later, right? So the farmer doesn't have to worry about what's what. As long as they get lined up right, then I clip the data later with the GIS software. So again, generally it's twice the width of the header, maybe different if you have other equipment, and then field length. I always prefer field length.
So key thing too is having a good statistician to help you out with working with this data too. It looks like,
well, and this is what Seth and I and others bring to the table, you see, and this is why I think, again, I'm jaded, Seth, but I think you and I wear white hats in this whole game. This is why it's important to have university research extension people working with you, because we bring those skill sets to the table. And frankly, sometimes can make or break whether the interpretation and the analyses are done correctly or not. And this is what we're skilled at. I mean, we do this every day of our life. This is why we are what we are. We know how to do this stuff, and that's well, I'll just stop there before I stick that shoe in any farther.
Again, winding down the last couple ones, we do have a question related back to the EOPP. What was it? The economic optimal planting population. As the price changes from your 350 price of corn, price stays the same. So just kind of curious how that.
Well, if the seed corn price is the same and the market price goes up, generally your optimum population will go up. And if the market price goes down, then generally your economic optimum population goes down. Right? It's just straightforward economics. And in the guidelines we put out, we have a little table in there of a range of market prices, a range of seed corn prices, and let you go through and pick it out yourself. I mean, you can calculate it, but we put together a table for you. But yeah, it's based on both grain price and seed corn price.
Last one, we'll get into your costs of all this. Somebody's talking about small farmers paying for all this stuff, so what would be your recommendation with a smaller farmer wanting to, do on-farm research, or, what's the cost of getting the technology to be able to do it?
And I assume they're talking about the cost of the precision technology. Do you reckon?
They don't specify here, but
if they are, it's a good point, because if you don't have yield monitor, if you don't have variable rate controls, it is true that if the less of that precision technology you have, the more you're going to go back to the time of a lot of logistical headaches to do this kind of on-farm research. And at that point, it probably comes down to the level of interest you have in doing it and how many headaches you're willing to put up with. We can still do it. It just makes it a lot more painful for the grower in terms of logistics. Okay. So, and the other thing we get here in Indiana, and I don't quite remember in Minnesota, but maybe in Southeast Minnesota, you might have the same issues of, well, we don't have big enough fields, you know, and a lot of our fields in Indiana are less than 30 acres. And so to do a trial with a lot of treatments, there just frankly isn't enough room in a field. And we run into that too. And unfortunately, that's also it's just an unfortunate fact of life. And so, for example, along the Ohio River, I would love to do some of our work down there along the Ohio River, but unfortunately, we're talking 10, 15, 20 acre fields, and with guys that are still using 24 row equipment to do it. Well, you know, right? You just can't do it, unfortunately, and so that's sometimes also an issue.
Yeah, I would just chime in really quick that, you know, I think that question's a good one. And sometimes those smaller farmers are actually exactly what we're looking for, because, you know, it's difficult to work with people with 120-foot wide planters. They're not our target clientele for these types of programs, because they move too fast, and or from field to field too quickly, and plant and harvest too quickly. But they also just sometimes
some of that is also
large.
the personality of those large growers.
That's
we
right.
have a few large growers that are just absolutely wonderful to work with, because they are still willing to take the time and the patience. And then we've had a few others that frankly we just end up not working with, because it becomes evident very quickly that, I don't want to say it's a nuisance for them, but they are in such a rush to get everything done that they do not pay the attention to detail. And unfortunately, or they're, as you say, sometimes their equipment is so huge that you can't hardly do anything with it. So no, I hear you.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, so the successful on-farm work that I've done, I mean, you got to have somebody who's really interested in the questions, willing to take the time, because it does take extra time to do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I see we're past our 9:30 mark. So anyway, just want to thank everybody for attending today. And again, remind you that there's a short survey that you'll get when you close out of this. If you please give us feedback on that, real short 3 questions. Again, thanks to our sponsors, the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. And of course, thanks to Bob and Seth for being with us today. And next week's session, that'll be same time again. And we'll be on making every acre pay. So we hope you join in with us next week, 8:30 to 9-ish, we say. And all right, so thanks much everybody for attending.
Thank you, Liz.
Thanks, Liz, Bob. Thank you very much.